The first thing that struck me about Lady Vivian Whitehaven was not her extraordinary beauty, nor even her youth, though at 32 she was nearly 20 years junior to her late husband, but rather the sheer audacity of her choice in mourning attire. I stood beside my friend Hercule Poirot on the gravel drive of Whitehaven Manor, watching as the Daimler drew to a halt before the imposing Georgian facade. The October afternoon was grey and bitter, with a thin mist rising from the Yorkshire moors that seemed to wrap the great house in an appropriately sombre shroud. All around us, the funeral guests moved in their customary black. Gentlemen in mourning coats, ladies draped in crepe and bombazine, their faces properly composed in expressions of respectful grief. And then she stepped from the motor car. Lady Vivian Whitehaven emerged like a vision from another world entirely, clad from head to toe in pristine white. Not cream, not ivory, not any of the subtle variations that might have suggested a compromise with convention, but white as fresh snow, white as a bride's gown, white as innocence itself. Her dress was exquisitely cut, the silk falling in perfect lines that spoke of Parisian couture. A white hat with a delicate veil framed her striking features, and white gloves covered her hands as she accepted the chauffeur's assistance. "Mon Dieu!" murmured Poirot beside me, his green eyes sharp with interest. "Observe, Hastings. Already the drama. It begins." The effect upon the assembled mourners was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned with the mechanical precision of marionettes. A lady near the entrance actually dropped her prayer book, the sound echoing across the suddenly silent courtyard like a gunshot. "Good Lord," I whispered. "She's done it deliberately, hasn't she? The scandal of it, wearing white to her own husband's wake." "Ah, but that is the question, is it not?" Poirot adjusted his tie with meticulous care, never taking his eyes from the approaching figure. "Is it scandal, or is it something else entirely? Consider, mon ami, the widow. She knows very well what she does. She's not, I think, a woman who acts without purpose." We had arrived at Whitehaven Manor that morning at the urgent invitation of Sir Reginald Whitehaven, the deceased lord's younger brother. His letter, received 3 days prior, had been brief but compelling. "Monsieur Poirot, Lord Bartholomew's death has been certified as heart failure, but there are circumstances surrounding his final days that trouble me greatly. His widow's behavior has been peculiar. I fear there are matters here that require the attention of someone with your particular expertise. The wake is tomorrow. Your presence would be most appreciated. R. Whitehaven." Now, watching Lady Vivian's approach, I began to understand Sir Reginald's concerns. She moved with unhurried grace, seemingly oblivious to the shocked stares and whispered comments that followed in her wake. Her expression was composed, almost serene, but there was something in her dark eyes, a glitter of defiance, perhaps, or calculation, that made me distinctly uneasy. "Monsieur Poirot," she said as she reached us, her voice carrying the faintest trace of a continental accent. "Sir Reginald mentioned you might attend. I'm honored by your presence at such a difficult time." Poirot inclined his head with his customary politeness. "Madame, permit me to express my condolences. The loss of a husband, it is always a great sorrow." "Indeed," she replied, and I caught the briefest flicker of something, amusement, irony, across her features. "Bartholomew's death was quite unexpected." "The heart, it is unpredictable," Poirot observed gently. "Yet you seem remarkably composed, if I may say so." Lady Vivian's smile was enigmatic. "Grief takes many forms, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps you, with your understanding of human nature, can appreciate that mourning need not always conform to society's expectations." Before Poirot could respond, we were interrupted by the approach of a tall, distinguished gentleman whose resemblance to the portraits hanging in the manor's great hall marked him unmistakably as Sir Reginald Whitehaven. His face was flushed with what appeared to be suppressed anger, and his eyes fixed upon his sister-in-law with undisguised disapproval. "Vivienne," he said curtly, barely acknowledging her attire, though his jaw tightened visibly. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, thank you for coming. Shall we proceed inside? The vicar is waiting to begin." As we moved toward the manor's entrance, I noticed other members of the family gathering on the steps. There was Miss Constance Whitehaven, Lord Bartholomew's spinster sister, her thin face pinched with disapproval as she regarded the widow's white ensemble. Beside her stood young Geoffrey Whitehaven, the deceased lord's nephew and heir, his boyish features troubled as he watched his new stepmother with obvious confusion. Dr. Pemberton, the family physician, hovered nearby, his professional composure barely concealing what appeared to be deep unease. "Tell me, madame," Poirot said quietly to Lady Vivian as we climbed the stone steps, "your choice of attire today. It has significance beyond the merely aesthetic." She paused, one gloved hand resting on the iron balustrade, and turned to face him directly. "In my country, Monsieur Poirot, white is the color of mourning. It represents the purity of the soul's departure, the hope of resurrection. Perhaps English customs are not the only ones worthy of respect." "Ah," said Poirot softly. "And what country would that be, madame?" For just a moment her composure wavered. "I have lived in many places, Monsieur Poirot. One learns to adapt." We entered the great hall of Whitehaven Manor, where Lord Bartholomew lay in state. The coffin, draped in black velvet, was surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements, all white lilies and roses. I noticed matching the widow's attire with what seemed like deliberate symbolism. Candles flickered in tall brass holders, casting dancing shadows across the assembled mourners. As the vicar began his solemn words, I found my attention drawn not to the service, but to the subtle tensions playing out among the family members. Sir Reginald's hands were clenched at his sides as he watched his sister-in-law. Miss Constance dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, her gaze never leaving the white-clad figure. Young Geoffrey appeared genuinely distressed, but whether by grief or by the family drama unfolding around him, I could not say. Poirot, I noticed, was studying not the mourners, but the room itself. His sharp eyes moved methodically from the coffin to the flowers, from the portraits on the walls to the servants standing at respectful attention near the doorway. When his gaze finally settled on a small side table bearing a silver tray with a coffee service, I saw his eyebrows lift almost imperceptibly. The service concluded, and the mourners began to move toward the drawing room for the traditional reception. As we followed the crowd, Poirot touched my arm lightly. "Hastings," he murmured, "observe the coffee service on the table beside Lord Bartholomew's favorite chair. What do you see?" I glanced back at the arrangement. "A coffee pot, cups, sugar bowl. Looks complete to me." "Precisely," said Poirot. "Complete, except for one small detail. There is no spoon, mon ami, and yet I am told by the butler that Lord Bartholomew always took 2 lumps of sugar in his coffee. One does not stir sugar without a spoon, n'est-ce pas?" Before I could respond, we were approached by Dr. Pemberton, his round face grave with concern. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a low voice, "Sir Reginald mentioned you might be here. I wonder if I might have a private word. There are aspects of Lord Bartholomew's final illness that have been troubling me. But of course, Doctor, perhaps after we have paid our respects to the family." Dr. Pemberton nodded, but his eyes strayed toward Lady Vivian, who was now holding court near the fireplace, her white dress a stark contrast to the black-clad mourners surrounding her. "Yes," he said quietly, "after we've observed the proprieties, though I must say some people seem to have their own interpretation of what constitutes proper behavior." As the afternoon wore on, I began to sense the undercurrents of tension that Sir Reginald's letter had hinted at. Conversation stopped when Lady Vivian approached. Glances were exchanged when she moved away, The very air seemed charged with unspoken accusations and suppressed resentments. It was nearly evening when Poirot and I finally found ourselves alone with Sir Reginald in the library, a comfortable room lined with leather-bound volumes and warmed by a crackling fire. "Monsieur Poirot," Sir Reginald began without preamble, "I must speak frankly. My brother's death may have been certified as natural, but I have grave doubts. His marriage to that woman," he gestured toward the door, beyond which Lady Vivian's voice could be heard in animated conversation, "was the talk of the county. A man of 68 marrying a woman barely half his age, and a foreigner at that." "The heart, it is not governed by logic," Poirot observed mildly. "But you suspect something more than an unfortunate romantic attachment." Sir Reginald's face darkened. Bartholomew changed after his marriage. He became secretive, suspicious. He dismissed servants who had been with the family for decades. He altered his will multiple times. And in his final weeks, he paused, struggling with the words. "He seemed afraid, Monsieur Poirot. My brother, who had never feared anything in his life, seemed genuinely terrified. And you believe Lady Vivian was the source of this fear?" "I believe," Sir Reginald said grimly, "that my brother discovered something about his wife that cost him his life, and her performance today, this mockery of mourning, only confirms my suspicions." Poirot steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "Yet she remains here, at the manor, surrounded by those who clearly suspect her. If she is guilty of murder, why does she not flee? Why does she draw attention to herself with such theatrical gestures?" "Perhaps," I suggested, "she's confident she won't be caught, or perhaps the white dress is meant to proclaim her innocence." "Ah, Hastings," Poirot smiled slightly. "Always you think in such direct lines. But consider, if one wishes to proclaim innocence, does one do so by scandalizing society? No, I think our Lady Vivian, she plays a more complex game than either guilt or innocence would suggest." As if summoned by our conversation, a soft knock came at the library door. Lady Vivian entered without waiting for permission, her white dress rustling softly in the firelight. "Gentlemen," she said, her dark eyes moving from Sir Reginald to Poirot with calculating interest. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but I wanted to speak with Monsieur Poirot before he retires for the evening." Sir Reginald rose stiffly. "I was just leaving. Vivian." He nodded curtly and departed, closing the door with perhaps more force than necessary. Lady Vivian moved to the chair he had vacated, settling herself with fluid grace. In the firelight, her white dress seemed to glow with an almost supernatural radiance. "You wish to speak with me, madame?" Poirot inquired politely. "I wish to understand you, Monsieur Poirot," she replied. "Reginald has brought you here for a purpose, and I suspect that purpose involves me. I prefer to know where I stand." "And where do you believe you stand, madame?" Her smile was enigmatic. "In a very precarious position, I should think. A young foreign widow, married to a wealthy older man who dies suddenly, wearing white to his wake. I can imagine the stories being whispered in the village. Yet you chose to wear white nonetheless." "I chose to honor my husband in the manner of my own people," she said firmly. "If English society finds that scandalous, perhaps the fault lies not with me but with their narrow understanding of grief." Poirot studied her for a long moment. "Tell me, madame, in the days before your husband's death, did you notice any change in his behavior, any source of distress or anxiety?" For the first time, her composure seemed to falter slightly. "Bartholomew was troubled, yes. He spoke of old debts, old sins. He had begun to review his papers obsessively, as if searching for something he had lost." "And did he find what he sought?" Lady Vivian's hands tightened in her lap. "I believe he did, Monsieur Poirot, and I believe it killed him." Before either of us could respond, she rose gracefully and moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. "Whatever you may think of me, Monsieur Poirot, remember this. I loved my husband, But love, as you surely know, is not always enough to save someone from their past. With that cryptic statement, she departed, leaving Poirot and me alone with a crackling fire and a growing sense that we had been drawn into a web of secrets far more complex than a simple case of matrimonial discord. "Well, Poirot," I said finally, "what do you make of her?" My friend was silent for a long moment, his green eyes reflecting the firelight as he stared into the flames. "I make of her, Hastings, a woman who is playing a very dangerous game," he said at last. "Whether she is the hunter or the hunted, I cannot yet say. But mark my words, before this affair is concluded, we shall discover that the widow who wore white to the wake holds the key to mysteries that go far deeper than the simple matter of appropriate mourning attire." As if to underscore his words, a scream suddenly pierced the evening quiet. A woman's scream, high and terrified, coming from somewhere within the depths of Whitehaven Manor. The scream pierced the evening quiet like a blade, coming from somewhere deep within the servants' quarters. Poirot was moving before the echo faded, his small frame surprisingly swift as we hurried through the green baize door that separated the family's domain from the working heart of the manor. We found Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, standing rigid in the narrow corridor, her face the color of old parchment. She pointed with a trembling finger toward an open door, beyond which lay what appeared to be a small storage room filled with cleaning supplies and household linens. "It's Jenkins, sir," she managed to whisper as Sir Reginald arrived, slightly out of breath. "The footman. He's gone, sir." Poirot approached the doorway with characteristic precision, his keen eyes taking in every detail before he stepped inside. I followed and immediately understood Mrs. Hartwell's distress. Young Jenkins lay crumpled among scattered cleaning cloths and silver polish, his face contorted in obvious agony. The distinct smell of bitter almonds hung in the close air of the small room. "Cyanide," Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the body without disturbing it. "But observe, Hastings, the positioning, the expression. This was not peaceful." "Good God," Sir Reginald breathed from the doorway. "First Bartholomew, now this. What is happening to this house?" Dr. Pemberton pushed through the gathering crowd of servants and family members, his medical bag in hand. "Let me examine him, Monsieur Poirot." "But of course, doctor, though I fear there is little doubt about the cause." Poirot stood, brushing dust from his immaculate trousers. "We must telephone immediately for the police. This is now a matter of murder." The word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled group. Lady Vivian had appeared at the edge of the crowd, her white dress ghostly in the dim corridor lighting. Her face showed no emotion, but her dark eyes were fixed intently on the scene. "Murder?" Geoffrey Whitehaven's young voice cracked slightly. "But why would anyone want to harm Jenkins?" "Perhaps," Poirot said quietly, "because Jenkins had discovered something he was not meant to know." Dr. Pemberton looked up from his examination. "There's something in his hand, a piece of paper, crumpled tight." "Do not disturb it yet," Poirot cautioned. "But tell me, who among you knew Jenkins well?" "He was a good lad," Mrs. Hartwell said, dabbing at her eyes. "Been with the family 3 years. Quiet, reliable, never gave any trouble." Miss Constance stepped forward, her thin face pinched with disapproval. "He served at table occasionally. I noticed he'd been nervous recently. Jumpy, you might say." "When did you first observe this nervousness?" Poirot inquired. "The past week or so. Since—" She glanced meaningfully at Lady Vivian. "Since certain changes in the household routine." Young Geoffrey cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I saw Jenkins yesterday evening, coming out of Uncle Bartholomew's study. He looked frightened when he saw me, hurried away without a word." The silence that followed was profound. Sir Reginald's face had gone ashen. "The study has been locked since Bartholomew's death," he said slowly. "I have the only key." "Not the only key." Lady Vivian spoke for the first time, her voice steady. Bartholomew gave me one shortly before he died. He said there were papers I might need to review. The collective intake of breath was audible. Every eye turned to the widow in white, and I could sense the shift in the atmosphere, from shock to suspicion. "You have had access to Lord Bartholomew's private papers." Miss Constance's voice was sharp with accusation. "I've had the key," Lady Vivian corrected coolly. "I have not yet used it." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yet Jenkins, it seems, found a way inside. The question becomes, what did he discover there that cost him his life?" Dr. Pemberton had carefully extracted the crumpled paper from Jenkins's death grip. He smoothed it gently. It was a page from a desk calendar, with a date from 2 weeks prior circled in red ink. "The day before Lord Bartholomew took ill," Geoffrey observed quietly. Poirot studied the paper with intense concentration. "Mes amis, we have here not one mystery, but two that are intimately connected. The death of Lord Bartholomew, the death of Jenkins, and the secrets hidden in that locked study. Before this night is over, I believe we shall discover that someone in this house has been playing a very dangerous game indeed." The sound of motor car engines in the courtyard announced the arrival of the local police, but I noticed that Lady Vivian had quietly withdrawn from the crowd. The widow, who wore white to the wake, was retreating to consider her position, and perhaps, I thought grimly, to destroy whatever evidence might remain in Lord Bartholomew's study. Inspector Chalmers of the Yorkshire Constabulary arrived with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to straightforward rural crimes rather than the labyrinthine mysteries that seem to flourish in great houses. He was a solid, practical fellow with greying whiskers and sharp blue eyes that surveyed the scene with obvious skepticism. "Cyanide in a servant's cupboard," he muttered, examining Jenkins's body with professional detachment. "Most irregular. Dr. Pemberton, you're certain of the cause?" "Without question, Inspector. The bitter almond scent, the facial contortion, the rapid onset, classic cyanide poisoning." Dr. Pemberton adjusted his spectacles nervously. "But there's something else that troubles me. Lord Bartholomew's final illness. In retrospect, I wonder if I was observing gradual poisoning rather than natural heart failure." Chalmers' eyebrows rose sharply. "You're suggesting murder?" "I'm suggesting the symptoms I observed, periods of confusion, metallic taste, digestive disturbances, could be consistent with arsenic administered over several weeks." The revelation sent a chill through the assembled household. Poirot, meanwhile, had been studying the storage room with characteristic precision, his keen eyes noting details others missed. "Inspector," he said quietly, "observe the floor near Jenkins's left hand. There's a faint residue of furniture polish, yet no cleaning materials were disturbed in that area. It suggests Jenkins encountered someone, or something, recently polished before his death." Chalmers grunted acknowledgement but seemed more interested in establishing facts than pursuing Poirot's subtle observations. He ordered the household assembled in the morning room for formal questioning. The interrogation began with Mrs. Hartwell, who confirmed Jenkins's evening routine and his recent nervousness. "Been jumpy for days, Inspector, ever since his lordship started talking about missing papers and changing locks." Miss Constance, seated rigidly upright, provided the most damaging testimony. "Jenkins had been asking peculiar questions about my brother's correspondence, particularly letters from abroad. Most inappropriate for a servant." Young Geoffrey's account proved equally troubling. He seemed especially interested in Uncle Bartholomew's recent visitors and whether he'd received any legal documents. I thought it odd at the time. When Chalmers turned to Lady Vivian, the tension in the room became palpable. She had changed from her scandalous white dress into conventional black, though the effect seemed less convincing than her earlier theatrical display. "Lady Whitehaven, you possess a key to your husband's study?" "Yes," she replied calmly. "Bartholomew gave it to me shortly before his death." "Have you used it?" For a moment, her composure wavered. Initially no, but this evening, after Jenkins was found, I felt compelled to pay my respects to my husband's memory. I unlocked the study briefly. Sir Reginald's face darkened. You said nothing of this earlier. I was not asked directly, she replied coolly. The key is in my possession, and I used it. What I found there. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Bartholomew had been corresponding with his solicitor, Mr. Carfax, about alterations to his will. There were also references to what he called ghosts in the ledger, old debts or obligations that troubled him greatly. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. Lord Bartholomew did mention receiving a disturbing letter recently. He seemed quite agitated about it. Said something about the past refusing to stay buried. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. And the date of this letter, Doctor? 2 weeks ago, I believe. The same date circled on that calendar page Jenkins was clutching. Chalmers made rapid notes, his earlier skepticism giving way to professional concern. Right then. I'll need that study examined thoroughly, and I want Lord Bartholomew's body exhumed for proper toxicological analysis. Lady Vivian remained composed, but I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her black skirts. Inspector, if my husband was indeed murdered, surely you cannot suspect me. I nursed him personally during his illness, prepared his meals, administered his medications. She stopped abruptly, realizing how her words might be interpreted. The implication hung heavy in the air. Whoever had poisoned Lord Bartholomew had required intimate, daily access to his food and drink. Poirot rose from his chair with characteristic precision. Inspector, if I may suggest, the study holds the key to both deaths. Jenkins discovered something there that cost him his life. Until we understand what ghosts in the ledger means, we cannot hope to solve either murder. As the questioning concluded, I noticed Lady Vivian slip quietly from the room. The widow who wore white to the wake was retreating once again, but this time, I suspected, to confront whatever secrets lay hidden in her dead husband's papers. Secrets worth killing to protect. The morning brought a thin, persistent rain that drummed against the windows of Whitehaven Manor, casting the great house in shades of grey that seemed to mirror the sombre mood within its walls. Inspector Chalmers had arrived early with his sergeant, and together we made our way to Lord Bartholomew's study, the room that promised to hold the key to both deaths. The heavy oak door swung open to reveal a chamber that spoke of scholarly pursuits and methodical habits. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines creating a tapestry of legal texts, estate records, and maritime histories. Yet something was immediately wrong with the scene before us. Curious, Poirot murmured, his keen eyes surveying the room with characteristic precision. Observe, Inspector. The room appears orderly, yet there are subtle signs of disturbance. See how the papers on the desk lie not quite aligned, how certain books protrude slightly from their shelves. Chalmers nodded grimly. Someone's been through here, but they've tried to cover their tracks. He moved to the massive mahogany desk that dominated the room. This central drawer was locked when we first arrived last night. Had to have it opened under police authority. The drawer revealed a treasure trove of correspondence and legal documents, but it was a leather folder marked Carfax and Henderson Solicitors that immediately commanded attention. Chalmers extracted a formal letter, his eyebrows rising as he read. "Well, this puts a different complexion on things," he said slowly. "It's a new will, dated just 2 weeks ago, the same date that was circled on Jenkins's calendar page. Lord Bartholomew is planning to revoke all previous testamentary documents and establish significant annuities for," he paused, studying the names, "foreign individuals, by the look of it. None of them family members." Sir Reginald, who had joined us despite the early hour, went pale. "Foreign beneficiaries. Bartholomew never mentioned any such intentions to me. Poirot moved to examine a ledger that lay open on a side table, its pages yellowed with age. "Ah, here perhaps we find our ghosts in the ledger," he said softly. "These appear to be shipping records dating back some 20 years, and see here." He pointed to a notation in the margin, written in Lord Bartholomew's distinctive hand. "The Meridian. God forgive me." Dr. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, his round face grave. "Monsieur Poirot, Inspector, I've just received confirmation from London. The toxicology results show significant arsenic levels in poor Jenkins, though the immediate cause of death was cyanide. But there's something else that troubles me greatly." "Yes, Doctor," Poirot prompted. 20 years ago, I was a young physician just starting my practice. I treated several survivors of a shipping disaster, refugees from Eastern Europe whose vessel, the Meridian, foundered off the Scottish coast. Lord Bartholomew owned that ship. Dr. Pemberton's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There were questions about the vessel's seaworthiness, suggestions of negligence. Many passengers were lost, including entire families. The silence that followed was profound. Sir Reginald sank into a chair, his face ashen. "Bartholomew was investigated but never charged," he said hoarsely. "The inquiry was inconclusive, but it haunted him. He established a charitable fund for the survivors, though he rarely spoke of the incident." Poirot's attention had shifted to a small alcove behind the desk, where his sharp eyes had detected something the others had missed. "Inspector, if you would examine this section of paneling, I believe you will find it conceals a hidden compartment." Chalmers' sergeant quickly located the mechanism, revealing a narrow space behind the wood. The compartment was empty, but faint scratches on its interior suggested recent use. "Whatever was kept here has been removed," Chalmers observed, "and recently, by the look of it." "The question becomes," Poirot said quietly, "who knew of this hiding place, and what did they remove?" As if summoned by our discussion, Lady Vivian appeared in the doorway. Gone was her theatrical white dress, replaced by conventional black, but her dark eyes held a haunted quality that had not been present before. "Gentlemen," she said, her continental accent more pronounced in her distress, "I believe I owe you an explanation. My knowledge of my husband's affairs extends beyond what I initially revealed." She moved to the window, gazing out at the rain-swept moors. "Bartholomew spoke often of old debts that demanded payment. He said there were people, survivors of past tragedies, who deserved recompense for suffering caused by his business decisions. And you encouraged this charitable impulse?" Poirot inquired gently. Her smile was bitter as winter frost. "I had my own reasons for supporting his desire to make amends, Monsieur Poirot. You see, I am not merely Lady Vivian Whitehaven. My birth name was Viviana Kowalski, and 20 years ago, my family sought passage to America aboard a ship called the Meridian." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Even Poirot's composed features showed a flicker of surprise. "My parents and younger brother were among those who perished when the ship foundered," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow. "I survived, but I have carried the knowledge of Lord Bartholomew's negligence for 20 years. "And yet you married him," Inspector Chalmers said, his tone carefully neutral. "I married him," she replied quietly, "because sometimes the desire for justice can consume one's entire existence. But I discovered something unexpected, that guilt had already accomplished what revenge could not. Bartholomew Whitehaven was already a broken man." Poirot stepped forward, his green eyes intense with concentration. But someone else was not content to let guilt serve as punishment, n'est-ce pas? Someone who knew of your true identity, who perhaps saw an opportunity in the tragic coincidence of your marriage. Lady Vivian's composure finally cracked. "I fear, Monsieur Poirot, that my presence in this house has awakened ghosts that were better left undisturbed. And now those ghosts have claimed not one life, but two. The atmosphere in Lord Bartholomew's study had grown oppressive, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of 20-year-old secrets. Lady Vivian's revelation hung in the air like smoke, transforming everything we thought we understood about the case. Inspector Chalmers was the first to break the stunned silence. "So you came here under false pretenses, married a man you held responsible for your family's death, and now stand to inherit his fortune. That's quite a convenient arrangement, wouldn't you say?" "Convenient?" Lady Vivian's voice carried a bitter edge. "Inspector, there is nothing convenient about living with the knowledge that your husband's negligence killed your parents. Nothing convenient about watching a man torture himself with guilt while wondering if justice and mercy can coexist." Before Chalmers could respond, we heard the sound of a motor car on the gravel drive. Sir Reginald moved to the window, his face brightening with relief. "That will be Carfax," he announced. "I telegraphed him this morning. If anyone can make sense of Bartholomew's legal arrangements, it's our solicitor." Mr. Carfax proved to be a thin, precise man with silver hair and sharp features that reminded me of a hunting bird. He entered shaking rain from his coat, his leather portfolio clutched protectively against his chest. "Sir Reginald, Lady Whitehaven." He nodded formally before acknowledging the rest of us. "Inspector Chalmers, I presume. I came immediately upon receiving word of these tragic events." His gaze lingered on Lady Vivian with what seemed like professional assessment. "I trust the new testamentary documents have been located?" "Indeed they have," Chalmers replied grimly, "along with some rather disturbing information about the beneficiaries." Carfax's expression remained carefully neutral, but I noticed his knuckles whiten slightly as he gripped his portfolio. Lord Bartholomew was most insistent about those charitable provisions. He felt certain moral obligations that transcended mere legal requirements. Poirot stepped forward, his green eyes intense with interest. "Moral obligations, Monsieur Carfax. How long had you been aware of Lady Vivian's true identity as a Meridian survivor?" The solicitor's composure flickered momentarily. Lord Bartholomew confided certain historical matters. Yes, he felt a profound responsibility to make restitution to those affected by past business decisions. "And yet," Poirot continued gently, "the new will provided for beneficiaries beyond Lady Vivian herself. Who were these other parties?" Carfax opened his portfolio with deliberate care, extracting several documents. Other survivors of the Meridian disaster, their descendants, families who suffered losses. He paused, studying one particular page with growing puzzlement. "There's something rather unusual here. One of the beneficiaries is listed as J. Kowalski, care of Whitehaven Manor Staff Quarters." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Lady Vivian went white as her wedding dress, her hand flying to her throat. "Impossible," she whispered. "My brother Jean died in the wreck. I saw him go under myself." Poirot's voice was very quiet. "Or perhaps, madame, someone wanted you to believe he had died. Tell me, would you recognize your brother after 20 years? A man who had perhaps changed his name, altered his appearance, taken employment in circumstances where he might observe the family responsible for his suffering." The terrible logic of it began to unfold before our eyes. Young Jenkins, nervous, curious Jenkins who had served at table, who had access to Lord Bartholomew's food and medications, who had been asking questions about foreign correspondence. "Jenkins," Sir Reginald breathed, his face ashen. "Good God, you're suggesting Jenkins was her brother." Lady Vivian rose unsteadily, her composure finally cracking. "If John is alive, if he's been here all this time, watching, planning—" She turned to Poirot with desperate eyes. "You must understand, Monsieur Poirot. Jean was only 14 when our parents drowned. The trauma, the years of believing himself orphaned, what might such experiences do to a young mind?" "They might," Poirot replied gravely. "Create a desire for revenge that far exceeded your own quest for justice. a revenge that would not be satisfied with financial restitution or moral acknowledgement. Dr. Pemberton, who had been listening with growing alarm, stepped forward. But that would mean Jenkins, John, had been slowly poisoning Lord Bartholomew while pretending to serve him. The psychological torment alone. "Consider the exquisite cruelty of it," Poirot said softly. "To watch one's victim suffer not only physical deterioration, but the additional anguish of knowing his wife was a survivor of his greatest failure. To orchestrate a situation where Lord Bartholomew's guilt would be compounded daily by the presence of those he had wronged." Inspector Chalmers had been following the conversation with mounting excitement. "It explains everything: the access to poison, the knowledge of household routines, the interest in legal documents. But why did Jenkins, John, end up dead himself?" Poirot moved to examine the mantelpiece, where a brass clock gleamed with fresh polish. "Observe, Inspector. This clock was cleaned recently, yet Mrs. Hartwell informed us that Jenkins polished it every Friday evening as one of his special duties. It was while performing this regular task that he discovered something, or someone discovered him." He turned back to the assembled group, his expression grave. "I believe Jan Kowalski's carefully laid plans began to unravel. Perhaps he realized his true identity was about to be exposed. Perhaps he discovered that his sister had genuinely come to care for their mutual enemy. Or perhaps—" Poirot's gaze moved meaningfully around the room, settling on each face in turn. "Perhaps someone else in this house learned of his true identity and saw an opportunity to eliminate both a dangerous witness and a convenient scapegoat." The silence that followed was profound. Somewhere in Whitehaven Manor, the ghost of the Meridian disaster had indeed claimed its revenge, but the true architect of that revenge might not be the one lying dead in the servants' quarters. Young Geoffrey cleared his throat nervously. "There's something else, Monsieur Poirot. I checked Uncle Bartholomew's strongbox this morning. Several bearer bonds are missing, bonds he'd mentioned keeping for immediate payments to his beneficiaries." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "And so we have not only murder and revenge, but theft as well. The plot, as they say, thickens considerably." Lady Vivian sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "If Jan is truly dead, then I have lost my brother twice. And if someone killed him to cover their own crimes," her voice broke, "then his quest for justice has made him a victim once again." The rain continued to lash against the windows, and I could not shake the feeling that we were still far from understanding the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen Whitehaven Manor. The widow who wore white to the wake had revealed her secrets, but someone else's remained hidden in the shadows. The atmosphere in Whitehaven Manor had grown thick with suspicion and unspoken accusations. Inspector Chalmers busied himself with the methodical collection of evidence, but Poirot seemed unusually contemplative, standing before the rain-lashed windows of the morning room with his fingertips pressed together in characteristic fashion. "You are thinking, Poirot?" I ventured, joining him at his observation post. "I am arranging, Hastings," he replied softly, his green eyes reflecting the grey morning light. "Like a bibliothèque that has been ransacked by thieves, the facts of this case have been scattered and replaced in deliberate disorder. Someone wishes us to see only what they choose to reveal." Sir Reginald, who had been pacing restlessly near the fireplace, turned sharply at Poirot's words. "Surely the matter is clear enough now, Monsieur Poirot. This Jenkins, this Jan Kowalski, infiltrated our household with murder in his heart. The only mystery remaining is why he chose to end his own life with cyanide." "Ah, but that is precisely where the arrangement becomes most interesting," Poirot murmured. "Consider, Sir Reginald, a man who has waited 20 years for revenge, who has achieved the slow death of his enemy through patient poisoning. Would he choose the very moment of his triumph to destroy himself? None, it does not have the logic." Before Sir Reginald could respond, Inspector Chalmers entered with his sergeant, both carrying evidence boxes. "We've completed our search of Jenkins's quarters," Chalmers announced. "Found some interesting items that shed new light on the situation. The sergeant placed a small trunk on the table, its simple lock already forced. Chalmers extracted a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth, their foreign postmarks immediately catching the eye. Correspondence from Poland and Germany, Chalmers explained. Some addressed to Jan Kowalski, others to John Jenkins, all from the same hand, a woman's writing. Lady Vivian stepped forward, her pale face showing recognition. They would be from my aunt, my mother's sister. After the Meridian disaster, she took in survivors, helped them start new lives. Her voice caught slightly. I believed Jan had perished. She never told me he had survived. Poirot examined the letters with characteristic precision, his eyebrows rising as he read. Most illuminating. Listen to this passage from 10 years ago. Jan, you must not write of these dangerous things. The man from England, the one you seek, he has powerful friends. If he learns you survived, he will try again to silence you. He has too much to lose if the truth emerges. The implications settled over the room like a shroud. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat nervously. Someone attempted to eliminate Jan before, but who would have such reach, such influence? That, Doctor, is the question that troubles me greatly, Poirot replied, reaching deeper into the trunk. His fingers closed around a small, leather-bound notebook. But perhaps this will provide answers. The notebook's early pages were filled with Polish script, but toward the end, the entries shifted to careful English. Poirot read selected passages aloud. February 3rd. I've found him at last. Whitehaven, the ship owner who condemned my family to death. He lives in luxury while they rest on the ocean floor. I will not act hastily. Justice must be perfect, complete. He turned several pages. June 12th. An unexpected development. My sister Viviana has come to this house as Whitehaven's bride. She does not recognize me. 20 years have changed us both. I will not reveal myself. She must remain untainted by what I plan to do. Lady Vivian pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, overcome by the revelation of her brother's proximity and his desire to protect her, even in his quest for revenge. Poirot continued to the final entries, dated just days before Jenkins's death. October 15th. I have discovered the hidden records in Whitehaven's study. They prove not only his negligence with the Meridian, but something far worse. Another man profited from the disaster, helped cover up the evidence. He is still here, still close to the family. I must decide how to proceed. The final entry was even more ominous. October 17th. I confronted him today. He denies nothing, shows no remorse, says the past is buried and should remain so. But I have the proof now. Documents, correspondence, financial records. Tomorrow I will decide whether to go to the authorities or handle this myself. The truth will not stay buried forever. Inspector Chalmers whistled low. So Jenkins discovered a second culprit in the Meridian affair, someone still living in this house. Precisely, Poirot agreed, and that someone decided that Jan Kowalski had become too dangerous to live. The missing element. Mr. Carfax, who had been studying legal documents in the corner, suddenly looked up with alarm. Gentlemen, there's another matter of grave concern. I've been reviewing Lord Bartholomew's recent financial transactions. 3 weeks ago, he withdrew bearer bonds worth £50,000 from his London accounts. Sir Reginald's face went ashen. 50,000? Bartholomew never mentioned such a sum to me. The withdrawal was noted as immediate restitution payments to verified Meridian survivors. Carfax continued. But those bonds are nowhere to be found. They vanished completely. Young Geoffrey, who had been silent throughout the morning's revelations, suddenly spoke up. I checked Uncle Bartholomew's strongbox yesterday, remember? Several bonds were missing. I thought it was just, well, I didn't know their significance then. Poirot's sharp gaze fixed on the young man. And when did you first notice these bonds were absent, Monsieur Geoffrey? I'd seen them before, you understand. Uncle Bartholomew sometimes showed me his emergency reserves. But when I looked yesterday, after all the talk of beneficiaries and new wills—" Geoffrey's voice trailed off uncomfortably. "The web tightens." Dr. Pemberton, who had been examining his notes from the previous evening, made a disturbing observation. "There's something else troubling me about Jenkins's death. When I examined his body, I noticed his fingernails showed signs of chronic arsenic exposure. If he had been carefully administering poison to Lord Bartholomew, he would have taken precautions to avoid contaminating himself. Unless," Poirot said quietly, "he too was being poisoned, perhaps by the same hand that killed Lord Bartholomew, using John as an unwitting accomplice while accelerating the process." The terrible logic of it began to unfold. Someone had discovered Jan's identity and his plan for revenge, then manipulated the situation to their own advantage, allowing the young man to begin the poisoning while secretly increasing the dosage, ultimately eliminating both victim and accomplice. Miss Constance, who had been listening with growing agitation, suddenly rose from her chair. "This is all speculation and wild theorizing. We're dealing with facts here, a servant who infiltrated our household with murder in his heart, and a foreign woman who married my brother under false pretenses." Her outburst was so vehement that everyone turned to stare. Poirot observed her with particular interest, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes avoided direct contact with Lady Vivian. "You are quite right, mademoiselle," Poirot said smoothly. "Facts are indeed what we require, and the facts tell us that someone in this house possessed intimate knowledge of both the Meridian disaster and the current household routines. Someone who could move freely, who had access to food and drink, who knew where important documents were kept." He paused, his gaze moving slowly around the assembled group. "Someone who stood to lose a great deal if Lord Bartholomew's charitable impulses were allowed to proceed unchecked." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Somewhere in Whitehaven Manor, the true architect of murder was waiting, watching, perhaps already planning their next move. As if sensing the growing tension, Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with alarm. "Begging your pardon, but there's been another incident. Someone's been in the study again, papers scattered, drawers forced open, and—" She paused, wringing her hands. "And there's a smell in there, sir. A bitter smell like almonds." Poirot was moving before she finished speaking, his small frame surprisingly swift as he headed toward Lord Bartholomew's study. The widow who wore white to the wake had revealed her secrets, but someone else's remained hidden in the shadows, someone desperate enough to kill again to protect them. The game, as they say, was far from over. The bitter almond scent struck us before we crossed the threshold of Lord Bartholomew's study, hanging in the air like a malevolent spirit. Yet this time, there was no corpse to account for the deadly perfume. Instead, we found systematic destruction, papers scattered across the Persian carpet, drawers yanked open with violent haste, and books tumbled from their shelves in apparent chaos. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, surveying the scene with his characteristic precision. "Someone has been most thorough, yet observe. Hastings. Certain areas remain untouched. The vandalism, it is selective, purposeful." Inspector Chalmers knelt beside the overturned desk, noting the forced secret compartment hanging open like a broken jaw. "Whatever was hidden there is definitely gone now. But look here." He pointed to a delicate porcelain coffee cup lying overturned near the fireplace, its dark contents staining the hearth rug. Beside it lay a small glass vial, uncorked and empty. "Cyanide again," I observed grimly. "But where's the intended victim?" "That, mon ami, is the question most pertinent," Poirot murmured, moving to examine the fireplace more closely. "But see here, these crystalline residues on the brass fender and the scorch marks. Someone has been burning documents using chemical assistance to ensure complete destruction." Dr. Pemberton, who had followed us into the study, peered at the evidence with professional interest. Cyanide compounds can indeed accelerate combustion, though it's an extraordinarily dangerous method. Why take such risks merely to destroy papers? Because, Poirot replied softly, these were not merely papers, Doctor. They were secrets worth killing to protect. Before anyone could respond, young Geoffrey burst through the doorway, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. Monsieur Poirot, I've been researching in the library. I found something extraordinary about the Meridian disaster. We followed him to the oak-paneled library, where several maritime law volumes lay open on the reading table. Geoffrey's discovery proved illuminating indeed. Insurance records showing the Meridian had been deliberately overinsured just weeks before its fatal voyage. Insurance fraud combined with criminal negligence, Geoffrey explained breathlessly. The company initially refused payment, citing evidence of deliberate sabotage. But somehow the investigation was dropped and full payment made. Lady Vivian sank into a chair, overwhelmed. You're saying my family wasn't just victims of negligence, but of deliberate murder for profit? I fear so, madame, Poirot confirmed gravely. And your brother, John, had discovered this truth. It explains the desperate measures taken to silence him. The web unravels. At that moment, Mr. Carfax appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain. Gentlemen, I've just received disturbing news from London. My offices were burglarized last night. Specifically, files relating to Lord Bartholomew's affairs were targeted. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with dangerous understanding. Most illuminating, Monsieur Carfax. Tell me, who else knew you maintained such comprehensive historical records? Before the solicitor could answer, Miss Constance materialized in the entrance, her thin face rigid with disapproval. Mr. Carfax, surely you're not sharing confidential family matters with outsiders. Her interruption was so perfectly timed that all eyes turned to her. Poirot studied her with laser-like intensity. Mademoiselle Constance, how fortuitous. We were discussing the insurance arrangements for the Meridian. Arrangements that netted considerable profit for certain parties while condemning innocent families to death. Miss Constance's composure flickered momentarily. I know nothing of such ancient business. My concerns are with protecting this family's present welfare. Precisely, Poirot agreed smoothly. The question becomes, what lengths would one go to protect the Whitehaven reputation and fortune? The psychological game. Inspector Chalmers had been following the exchange with growing understanding. Miss Constance, I need to ask your whereabouts yesterday evening when Jenkins died, and this morning when the study was ransacked. In my room, naturally, she replied stiffly, but her hands trembled slightly against her black skirts, attending to correspondence and family matters. Ah, correspondence, Poirot mused. With whom do you correspond regarding family matters, mademoiselle? My private letters are no concern of yours, she snapped, then gestured accusingly toward Lady Vivian. Surely your attention should focus on more obvious suspects. A foreign woman who married my brother under false pretenses, whose brother infiltrated our household with murder in his heart. The outburst was so violent that everyone stepped back in shock. In the sudden silence, Poirot's quiet voice carried with devastating clarity. But that is precisely the point, is it not, mademoiselle? Jan Kowalski's quest for revenge provided the perfect cover for your own desperate measures. He moved to the mantelpiece, studying a sepia photograph of Lord Bartholomew with an older, stern-faced gentleman. This photograph troubled you greatly, I think. Your father and his business partner, Mr. Carfax's father, perhaps, the true architects of the Meridian conspiracy. Mr. Carfax went pale as parchment. How did you— The pattern, monsieur. It repeats itself across generations. The insurance fraud, the diverted funds meant for survivors, the conspiracy of silence. When John discovered not just Lord Bartholomew's guilt, but the broader conspiracy involving your family's law firm, he became a threat to more than just one man's reputation. The final revelation. Miss Constance's rigid composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. It was for the family, for the Whitehaven name. Bartholomew was going to confess everything, give away our fortune to those foreigners. After the scandal nearly destroyed us 20 years ago, we couldn't survive another public humiliation. So you decided to eliminate the threats," Poirot continued relentlessly. "When Jan began poisoning Lord Bartholomew with arsenic, slowly, as befitted his desire for prolonged suffering, you saw an opportunity. You accelerated the process, ensuring your brother's death while leaving Jan as the obvious suspect. And when Jan discovered the missing funds, the £50,000 in bearer bonds that should have gone to Meridian survivors, but were instead diverted to protect family investments, you silenced him with cyanide," Inspector Chalmers added grimly. Miss Constance collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "I only wanted to protect what was ours. The bonds, the reputation, the family legacy. Jenkins was asking too many questions about the old accounts, about funds that were redirected for the family's benefit. But the cyanide in the study this morning," Poirot pressed gently. "What documents were so dangerous they required such extreme destruction?" Through her tears, Miss Constance pointed at the photograph. "Correspondence between our fathers, records of the conspiracy, evidence of the insurance fraud. When I realized you were getting close to the truth, I had to destroy everything that could implicate the family. Both families. Justice and resolution." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Miss Constance's quiet weeping and the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Inspector Chalmers stepped forward with grim professionalism. "Miss Constance Whitehaven, I arrest you for the murders of Lord Bartholomew, Whitehaven and Jan Kowalski, also known as John Jenkins. You're also charged with theft of bearer bonds and conspiracy to defraud insurance companies." As the constables led her away, Lady Vivian remained seated, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point. The widow who wore white to the wake had indeed been at the center of the mystery, not as perpetrator, but as the unwitting catalyst whose presence had awakened ghosts that demanded their due. Poirot adjusted his tie with meticulous care, watching the rain wash the courtyard clean. The tragedy, Hastings, is that Miss Constance's crimes were ultimately pointless. The truth of the Meridian would have emerged regardless. Justice delayed is not justice denied, merely justice made more terrible by the weight of accumulated guilt. The affair at Whitehaven Manor was concluded, but its echoes would resonate far beyond the Yorkshire moors, touching lives and reputations across 2 generations of carefully buried secrets. The arrest of Miss Constance Whitehaven cast a pall over Whitehaven Manor that seemed to seep into its very foundations. Inspector Chalmers had departed with his prisoner, leaving behind a household struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had been revealed. The rain had finally ceased, and pale afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, but the atmosphere remained heavy with unspoken grief and shame. Sir Reginald sat in his study, a brandy untouched at his elbow, staring into the fire with the hollow expression of a man whose world had been fundamentally altered. When Poirot and I joined him at his request, his first words carried the weight of profound disbelief. "I cannot reconcile it, Monsieur Poirot," he said quietly. "Constance, rigid, proper Constance, capable of such calculated brutality. Yes, she was obsessed with family honor, but murder. 2 murders?" Poirot settled into his chair with characteristic precision, his green eyes reflecting the firelight. "Sir Reginald, obsession is perhaps the most dangerous of human emotions because it masquerades as virtue. Your sister believed herself to be protecting something sacred, the Whitehaven name, the family legacy. But observe how quickly protection became destruction when that obsession was threatened." Poirot's methodical explanation. "From the beginning," Poirot continued, "certain elements of this case troubled me greatly. Lady Vivian's white dress was theatrical, yes, but it was also honest, a genuine expression of her cultural mourning customs and her complex relationship with grief. The real deception lay elsewhere, in the careful manipulation of an already tragic situation. He steepled his fingers thoughtfully. Jan Kowalski's presence in this house was indeed for revenge, but his method was slow, methodical, the prolonged suffering of a man seeking what he perceived as justice. The arsenic poisoning he administered was gradual, designed to torment rather than simply kill. Yet Lord Bartholomew's decline was too rapid for Jan's careful dosing alone. Someone with intimate access was accelerating the process? I interjected. Precisely, Hastings. And who possessed such access? Who could control Lord Bartholomew's meals, his medications, his daily routines without suspicion? Miss Constance, the devoted sister who had managed the household for decades. Poirot's explanation grew more detailed as he outlined the psychological profile that had led him to the truth. The missing spoon from the coffee service was not merely a matter of household disorder. Lord Bartholomew always took 2 lumps of sugar in his coffee. This required stirring. Without a spoon, he could not prepare his coffee as usual, suggesting someone else was controlling its preparation. Miss Constance was ensuring precise dosages while preventing Jan from administering his own doses according to his slower schedule. The deeper conspiracy. Lady Vivian entered quietly during Poirot's explanation, her black dress a stark contrast to the white ensemble that had caused such scandal at the wake. Her composed demeanor had returned, but her eyes held a new understanding of the tragedy that had befallen her family. When John discovered the ghosts in the ledger, Poirot continued, he found not only evidence of the original Meridian insurance fraud, but also the missing bearer bonds. £50,000 that should have gone to survivors but had been diverted to protect family investments. This discovery made him a threat, not just to Lord Bartholomew's conscience, but to the entire conspiracy of silence that had protected both the Whitehaven and Carfax family reputations for 20 years. Miss Constance killed Jan because he threatened to expose everything? Lady Vivian asked quietly. She killed him because her rigid worldview could not accommodate the destruction of what she considered the family's rightful place in society. The cyanide was administered when Jan confronted her with his evidence. The polished clock on the mantelpiece, that was her attempt to remove any trace of her presence during their final, fatal encounter. The moral reckoning. Sir Reginald looked up from his contemplation of the fire. And the ransacking of the study this morning? Desperation, Poirot replied simply. Miss Constance realized that Jan's death would inevitably lead to a thorough investigation. She attempted to destroy the remaining evidence of the historical conspiracy, using cyanide compounds to accelerate the burning of documents. It was a dangerous, desperate measure that revealed the extent of her panic. The silence that followed was broken by Lady Vivian's steady voice. There is something that must be addressed, and it cannot wait for the formal proceedings. She held a folded document in her gloved hands. This concerns the restitution that my husband intended. The fund for Meridian survivors that was diverted to protect family interests. Sir Reginald's shoulders sagged as if bearing a great weight. You want the bearer bonds restored to their original purpose. I want, Lady Vivian said with quiet dignity, what should have been done 20 years ago, not as charity, but as acknowledgement of debt. The £50,000 should be placed in proper legal trust, administered transparently, for identified survivors and their families. Justice and resolution. Poirot observed the exchange with approval. The law will deal with Miss Constance's crimes, but the broader question of moral restitution, that is a matter of conscience, not legal compulsion. Sir Reginald met Lady Vivian's gaze directly. And if I refuse, if I allow the matter to be buried with my sister's trial, then you will live with the knowledge that you had the opportunity to close the circle of injustice and chose to leave it open, Poirot replied gently. The scandal will emerge regardless. The Meridian story is too dramatic to remain hidden. The question is whether, when it comes, you will have already done what honor requires." After a long moment, Sir Reginald nodded slowly. "I will speak with Carfax immediately. We will trace the diverted funds, liquidate what must be liquidated, and establish the fund properly. Not as family charity, but, as you say, as a debt discharged." Lady Vivian bowed her head slightly. "Then I will remain until the arrangements are completed and the inquest concluded. After that, I intend to leave England. There is nothing here for me now but graves and memories." The widow's final truth. As the afternoon light began to fade, Poirot posed one final question. "Madame, when you wore white to the wake, was it truly only to honor your customs of mourning?" A faint, knowing smile touched Lady Vivienne's lips. "Partly, but also to remind myself, and everyone present, that death can bring clarity as well as sorrow. I wished them to see that I did not belong to their world of quiet, respectable concealment. White for revelation, Monsieur Poirot. White for truth finally brought to light." Poirot inclined his head approvingly. "Then you chose most wisely, madame. In a house built on buried secrets, you alone had the courage to dress for honesty." As we prepared to depart Whitehaven Manor, I reflected on the terrible irony of the case. The widow who wore white to the wake had indeed been at the center of the mystery, not as its architect, but as the unwitting catalyst whose presence had awakened ghosts that demanded their due. Justice, long delayed, had finally found its voice, though at a cost that would echo through the Yorkshire moors for generations to come. The affair at Whitehaven Manor was concluded, but its lessons about the price of buried guilt and the corrosive nature of family secrets would linger long after the last of the Meridian's ghosts had been laid to rest. The morning following Miss Constance's arrest dawned grey and subdued over Whitehaven Manor, as if the Yorkshire moors themselves mourned the terrible revelations that had shattered the ancient house's carefully maintained facade. Inspector Chalmers had departed with his prisoner in the early hours, but the weight of 20 years of buried secrets still pressed heavily upon those who remained. Poirot stood in the library, methodically arranging the scattered documents that told the complete story of the Meridian disaster and its aftermath. His green eyes moved with characteristic precision over each paper, ensuring that every detail was properly catalogued for the inevitable legal proceedings. Yet I sensed something more in his demeanor, a philosophical contemplation that went beyond mere evidence gathering. "The case troubles you still, Poirot?" I inquired, joining him at the mahogany table where the tragic history lay spread before us. "Not troubles, Hastings, but rather instructs," he replied, his voice carrying that particular tone I had learned to associate with his deeper insights into human nature. "This affair has revealed the extraordinary lengths to which people will go to protect what they perceive as their rightful place in the world. Miss Constance's crimes were terrible, yes, but they sprang from a twisted sense of duty that, in other circumstances, might have been admirable." Lady Vivienne's final truth. Before I could respond, Lady Vivienne appeared in the doorway. She had exchanged her scandalous white dress for a traveling costume of deep blue, and her bearing showed the quiet dignity of a woman who had found peace after long torment. In her hands, she carried a leather portfolio containing the final arrangements for the survivors' fund. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, approaching us with measured steps. "I wish to speak with you before your departure. There are matters that require complete honesty." She moved to the window overlooking the moors, her dark eyes reflecting the pale morning light. "When I married Lord Bartholomew, it was indeed with full knowledge of his role in my family's tragedy, but my motivations were not purely vengeful, nor were they entirely mercenary. They were, I must confess, painfully complex." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest, but his expression remained encouragingly neutral. "I genuinely came to care for him," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath. Bartholomew was a broken man, consumed by guilt for his past actions. In his final months, when he spoke of making amends and establishing funds for survivors, I encouraged him, not from calculation, but from a sincere desire to help him find the peace that had eluded him for decades. And yet you never revealed your true identity to him? Poirot inquired gently. Lady Vivian's composure wavered slightly. I tried several times, but each attempt seemed to cause him such profound anguish. He suspected, I believe. In his final days, he would look at me with such sorrowful understanding, as if he grasped the cruel irony of our situation. Perhaps that knowledge contributed to his decline as much as any poison Miss Constance administered. The practical resolution. Sir Reginald entered the library, his face showing the strain of recent revelations, but also a kind of determined resolution. The arrangements are complete, he announced, placing additional documents on the table. The £50,000 in bearer bonds have been recovered from Constance's private safe, along with accumulated interest and additional funds from the estate. The total now approaches £80,000. A substantial restitution, Poirot observed approvingly. It will be administered by an independent trustee in London, Lady Vivian added, with complete transparency and public oversight. No member of the Whitehaven family will have any involvement in its management. The survivors and their descendants will finally receive what should have been theirs 20 years ago. Mr. Carfax, who had arrived that morning to finalize the legal arrangements, cleared his throat uncomfortably. I must also report that my firm will be conducting a complete audit of all historical accounts related to the Whitehaven family. Any additional irregularities discovered will be addressed through proper legal channels. The solicitor's obvious discomfort suggested that the sins of the fathers would indeed be visited upon the sons, though perhaps in the form of professional disgrace rather than criminal prosecution. Poirot's final analysis. As the practical arrangements concluded, Poirot moved to examine the portrait of Lord Bartholomew that dominated one wall of the library. His study of the painted features was characteristically intense, as if seeking to understand the man behind the tragedy. "Madame," he said to Lady Vivian, "you have carried a burden of guilt that was never yours to bear. The tragedy of the Meridian was not caused by your presence here, nor by your brother's quest for justice. It was the inevitable consequence of crimes committed long before either of you arrived at this house." He turned to face the assembled group. Miss Constance's actions were not responses to external threats, but expressions of an internal corruption that had festered for decades. The family's complicity in covering up the original insurance fraud, their willingness to profit from mass tragedy, these sins created the conditions in which greater sins could flourish. Young Geoffrey, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Will there be more arrests? More revelations?" Poirot considered the question carefully. "The law will take its course, Monsieur Geoffrey. But I believe the worst of the truth has now been exposed. Sometimes the greatest justice lies not in punishment alone, but in the restoration of moral balance, in ensuring that wrongs are acknowledged and, where possible, made right." The final departure. As we prepared to leave Whitehaven Manor, the remaining members of the household gathered in the great hall. The absence of Miss Constance and the late Jenkins created a palpable void, but there was also a sense of cleansing, of poisonous secrets finally brought to light. Lady Vivian paused at the threshold, looking back at the portraits of long-dead Whitehavens gazing down from their gilded frames. "This house has harbored too many ghosts," she said quietly. "Perhaps now they can finally rest." Sir Reginald stepped forward, his expression showing new maturity born of terrible knowledge. "Lady Vivian, will you allow us to correspond? To know how the fund progresses, how the survivors fare?" She smiled gently, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since our arrival. "I will ensure you receive regular reports. The work of justice must continue long after the crimes themselves have been punished." Poirot's closing reflection. As our motor car pulled away from Whitehaven Manor, I glanced back to see the great house diminishing in the distance, its Georgian facade catching the pale morning light. The affair that had brought us there seemed almost dreamlike in retrospect. A widow in white, a servant with a hidden identity, a spinster whose devotion became deadly obsession. What will become of them all, do you think? I asked Poirot. They will endure, Hastings, because they have learned the most difficult lesson of all, that the past, however carefully buried, will always find a way to surface. Lady Vivian will transform her personal tragedy into constructive action. Sir Reginald will rebuild his family's reputation through honest acknowledgement of its failures. Even young Geoffrey will carry forward the knowledge that privilege brings responsibility. Poirot adjusted his tie with meticulous care, a gesture I had come to associate with his satisfaction at a case properly concluded. The widow who wore white to the wake chose her costume more wisely than she knew. In the end, she was the only one among them dressed for truth rather than deception. He was quiet for a moment, watching the Yorkshire landscape roll past our windows. The little grey cells, Hastings. They tell us that justice is not always swift, but it is persistent. Like water finding its way through stone, truth will eventually flow through even the most carefully constructed barriers of silence and respectability. As the moors faded behind us, I reflected on the complex web of human motivations we had unraveled. The ghosts of the Meridian had finally been laid to rest, but their legacy would endure. Not in the form of continued tragedy, but as a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal when truth replaces deception. And justice, however delayed, finally finds its voice. The affair at Whitehaven Manor was concluded, but its lessons about the corrosive nature of buried guilt and the redemptive power of honest acknowledgement would resonate far beyond the Yorkshire moors, touching lives and consciences for generations to come. The motor car pulled away from Whitehaven Manor as the Yorkshire moors began to shed their morning mist, revealing a landscape that seemed somehow cleansed by the recent revelations. Poirot sat in contemplative silence beside me, his green eyes reflecting the pale sunlight that had finally broken through the persistent clouds. It was a silence I recognized, the quiet satisfaction of a mind that had successfully untangled a complex web of human deception. "You are unusually reflective, Poirot," I observed as the great house diminished in our rear window. "Surely you must feel satisfaction at having resolved such an intricate case." He turned from his study of the passing countryside, his expression thoughtful. "Satisfaction, yes, mon ami, but also a profound sadness. This affair has illustrated with painful clarity how the sins of the past refuse to remain buried and how the pursuit of justice, however noble, can become corrupted by the very human failings it seeks to address." Poirot's method. Revealed. As our journey progressed, Poirot began to outline the deductive process that had led him to the truth. From the beginning, Hastings, certain elements of this case offended the little grey cell. The theatricality of Lady Vivian's white dress, for instance. A guilty woman seeks invisibility, not spectacle. Then there was the nature of Lord Bartholomew's fear in his final weeks. Sir Reginald described his brother as frightened of old debts, old sins, not of his young wife, whom he had chosen to marry, but of ghosts from his past. And Jenkins, Jan Kowalski. The brother seeking revenge fascinated me greatly. His nervousness, his questions about correspondence, his access to the household routines. Yes, I suspected his true identity early. But when he died clutching evidence in his hand, I asked myself, is this the endgame of a patient avenger, or the silencing of a dangerous witness by a more calculating mind? Poirot's hands moved expressively as he continued. Then there were the domestic details that spoke volumes. The missing spoon from Lord Bartholomew's coffee service. A man who always took 2 lumps of sugar could not prepare his coffee without stirring. Someone else was controlling its preparation, ensuring precise dosages while preventing Jan from administering his own poison. according to his slower schedule. The psychology of murder. Miss Constance's psychology was the key to understanding the entire tragedy, Poirot continued, his voice taking on the tone of gentle instruction. She was not driven by greed or passion, but by something far more dangerous, a twisted sense of duty. Her entire identity was bound to the Whitehaven name and its perceived honor. To her, Lord Bartholomew's desire for restitution was not an act of conscience, but a betrayal of everything she held sacred. I shook my head in wonder. To think that such rigid propriety could mask such calculated brutality. It is the eternal paradox of human nature, Hastings. Miss Constance genuinely believed she was protecting her family, yet her actions destroyed everything she sought to preserve. In attempting to prevent scandal, she created a far greater one. In trying to protect the family fortune, she ensured its dispersion under the most damaging circumstances possible. The question of justice. As the moors gave way to more civilized countryside, our conversation turned to the deeper philosophical implications of the case. This affair has demonstrated the many faces of justice, Poirot observed. Jan Kowalski sought retributive justice, punishment for those who wronged his family. Lady Vivian pursued restorative justice, acknowledgement of harm and meaningful restitution. Miss Constance perverted protective justice, turning the legitimate desire to shield one's family into murderous self-interest. But which form was correct? I asked. But that is the beauty and the tragedy of it, mon ami. Each believed their interpretation was righteous. Yet observe how their individual quests became corrupted by secrecy and deception. Lady Vivian's concealment of her identity, Jeanne's infiltration under false pretenses, Miss Constance's manipulation of the situation, all believing they served justice while creating the very conditions that made tragedy inevitable. The widow's wisdom. Poirot's expression grew thoughtful as he considered Lady Vivian's role in the drama. In the end, it was Lady Vivian who demonstrated the truest understanding of justice. Her choice to wear white to the wake was not merely cultural tradition or theatrical gesture. It was a declaration of moral clarity in a situation clouded by decades of deception. How so? White, Hastings, is the color of truth revealed, of secrets brought to light. In choosing to honor her husband's memory while simultaneously honoring her own family's tragedy, she refused to participate in the cycle of concealment that had poisoned the Whitehaven family for 20 years. Her presence forced all the hidden tensions to the surface, creating the conditions in which truth could finally emerge. The broader implications. As we approached the railway station where we would catch our train to London, Poirot offered his final assessment of the case. The affair at Whitehaven Manor will be remembered not merely as a tale of murder and detection, but as an illustration of how the past refuses to remain buried when injustice has been done. The ghosts of the Meridian demanded their due, and they received it, though at a cost that no one could have anticipated. And the Survivors' Fund. Do you think it will provide the healing Lady Vivian hopes for? Money alone cannot heal such wounds, mon ami, but acknowledgement can. The formal recognition that wrongs were done, that lives were lost through negligence and greed, that survivors and their families deserve restitution. This has value beyond mere financial compensation. Final reflections. As our train pulled away from Yorkshire, carrying us back to the familiar bustle of London, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary complexity of human motivations we had witnessed. The case had revealed how guilt and redemption, justice and vengeance, love and duty could become so entangled that even the most careful observer might struggle to separate them. The most profound lesson of this case, Poirot said, as if reading my thoughts, is that secrets, however carefully guarded, eventually demand their freedom. The truth of the Meridian disaster sought expression for 20 years before finding its voice through the tragic events at Whitehaven Manor. He adjusted his tie with characteristic precision, a gesture that signaled his satisfaction with a case properly concluded. The little grey cells tell us that justice is not always swift, but it is persistent. Like water finding its way through stone, truth will eventually flow through even the most carefully constructed barriers of silence and respectability. As London's familiar skyline came into view, I realized that the widow who wore white to the wake had indeed chosen her costume more wisely than anyone could have known. In a world too often dressed in the black of concealment and deception, she alone had possessed the courage to appear in the white of truth revealed. Her example would endure long after the last echoes of scandal had faded from the Yorkshire moors. The affair at Whitehaven Manor was concluded, but its deeper truths about guilt, redemption, and the persistent nature of justice would continue to resonate in the chambers of Poirot's little grey cells for years to come. For as long as men and women loved, feared, regretted, and concealed, there would always be mysteries for Hercule Poirot to solve, and perhaps a little justice to bring to a world that needed it more than it knew. The weeks following our return from Yorkshire brought the familiar rhythms of London life. The clip-clop of hansom cabs on cobblestones, the cry of newspaper vendors, the comfortable routine of our Baker Street lodgings. Yet despite the return to normalcy, I observed that Poirot remained unusually contemplative, his green eyes often distant as he sat by our window, watching the bustling street below. "The case continues to occupy your thoughts," I ventured one grey November morning, setting aside my newspaper. "Indeed, Hastings," he replied, turning from his observation post. "This affair has demonstrated something most profound about the nature of justice and human motivation. Consider the extraordinary symmetry of it all. Each principal figure received a fate that perfectly mirrored their deepest moral principle." He moved to his desk, where several letters lay neatly arranged. Lord Bartholomew, whose sin was to value profit above human lives, died slowly while forced to confront the true cost of his choices. Jan Kowalski, who devoted 20 years to vengeance, perished just as his revenge reached its climax, proof that retribution alone cannot sustain a soul. Miss Constance, who worshipped family honor above truth, lived to see that honor shattered by her own hands. And Lady Vivian, she who had every reason to live in bitterness chose instead to become the steward of restitution, Poirot said softly, lifting one of the letters. "She has written, you know. The first report on the Survivors' Fund. The widow's mission." The letter, written in Lady Vivian's elegant hand, was characteristically direct and purposeful. She had established herself in Warsaw, working with relief organizations to locate surviving Meridian passengers and their descendants. The fund, now totaling nearly £80,000 with accumulated interest, was being administered by an independent London trustee with complete transparency. "I do not know if peace is possible, Monsieur Poirot," she had written, "but I have learned that action is better than mere remembrance, and acknowledgement better than silence. The work of justice must continue long after the crimes themselves have been punished." "She has found her true calling," I observed, returning the letter. "She has transformed personal tragedy into constructive purpose," Poirot agreed. "That, mon ami, is perhaps the finest form of justice. Not merely punishment for wrongdoing, but the creation of something meaningful from the ashes of loss." The ripple effects. A telegram from Inspector Chalmers provided additional closure to the affair. Miss Constance's confession had exposed the full scope of the original Meridian conspiracy, leading to arrests in London and Edinburgh. The insurance fraud had involved multiple shipping companies and several prominent families, creating a scandal that would reverberate through British maritime commerce for years to come. "The ghosts of the Meridian continue to claim their due," Poirot observed, "but now they claim the guilty rather than the innocent. There is justice in that, even if it comes 20 years too late." Young Geoffrey had written as well, expressing his determination to rebuild the Whitehaven reputation through honest acknowledgement of past failures. Sir Reginald, chastened by the revelations, had committed to full cooperation with ongoing investigations and had established additional charitable works in his brother's memory. Philosophical reflections. As the afternoon light faded, Poirot's mood grew increasingly contemplative. He stood once again by our window, his hands clasped behind his back in characteristic fashion. This case has reminded me why I pursue this profession, Hastings. Not merely for the intellectual satisfaction of solving puzzles, but because someone must stand for the victims, those whose voices have been silenced by death, whose stories have been buried by shame or fear or greed. The Meridian passengers, you mean? All of them, he replied gravely. The original victims who perished in the North Sea, yes, but also Jan Kowalski, who died seeking justice for his family, and even Lord Bartholomew, who was ultimately murdered for his desire to make amends. Each deserved better than the silence that surrounded their suffering. He turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. The most profound lesson of this affair is that secrets, however carefully guarded, eventually demand their freedom. Like water finding its way through stone, truth will eventually flow through even the most carefully constructed barriers of silence and respectability. The human heart's complexity. What strikes me most, Poirot continued, settling into his chair, is how differently people respond to guilt and the call of conscience. Miss Constance's tragedy was not that she lacked moral feeling, but that her moral compass had become so distorted by obsession with family honor that she could no longer distinguish between protection and destruction, while Lady Vivian chose confrontation over concealment. Precisely. Her white dress at the wake was not merely cultural tradition or theatrical gesture. It was a declaration that she would no longer participate in the conspiracy of silence that had poisoned the Whitehaven family for 20 years. In a world dressed in the black of concealment, she alone had the courage to appear in the white of truth revealed. Final reflections. As evening settled over London, Poirot began composing his final case notes with characteristic precision. His pen moved steadily across the paper, recording not just the facts of the investigation, but his insights into the human motivations that had driven the tragedy. The affair at Whitehaven Manor, he said as he wrote, will be remembered not merely as a tale of murder and detection, but as an illustration of how the past refuses to remain buried when injustice has been done. The little grey cells tell us that justice may be slow, but it is relentless. It may wear many faces, but its ultimate purpose is always the same: to bring light where there is darkness and order where there is chaos. He looked up from his writing, his green eyes reflecting the gaslight's warm glow. The widow who wore white to the wake chose her costume more wisely than anyone could have known. She understood that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in seeking revenge, but in choosing to break the cycle of concealment that allows injustice to flourish. A month later, we received Lady Vivian's final letter from Poland, where she had established a permanent office for the Survivors' Fund. She had reclaimed her birth name, Viviana Kowalski, and dedicated herself fully to the work of restitution and remembrance. "The truth has been revealed, Monsieur Poirot," she wrote, "and with it the possibility of genuine healing. I no longer wear white, for mourning has given way to purpose. The ghosts of the Meridian are finally at peace." As Poirot filed away the correspondence that marked the true conclusion of the affair, I reflected on the extraordinary complexity of human nature we had witnessed. Love and hatred, justice and vengeance, truth and deception had become so entangled that only his methodical reasoning could separate them. Yet in the end, the little grey cells had prevailed, bringing order to chaos and justice to those who had waited 20 years for their voices to be heard. The widow who wore white to the wake had indeed chosen her costume wisely, a symbol of truth in a world too often dressed in deception, and proof that even the deepest wounds can heal when silence finally gives way to honesty. The affair at Whitehaven Manor was concluded, but its lessons about guilt, redemption, and the persistent nature of justice would continue to resonate in the chambers of Poirot's remarkable mind for years to come. The spring that followed our Yorkshire adventure arrived with the gentle persistence of truth itself, bringing renewal to London's grey streets and a sense of philosophical completion to the affair that had so deeply engaged Poirot's little grey cells. The bitter winter months had carried away the immediate sensation of the Whitehaven scandal, but like sediment settling in still water, the deeper truths of the case had crystallized into lasting insights. The final reckoning. It was on a morning when daffodils had begun to pierce the soil in Hyde Park that Inspector Chalmers' final communication reached us. The letter bore news that provided the ultimate closure to our investigation, though not in the manner any of us might have anticipated. Miss Constance Whitehaven died in custody 3 days ago. Poirot read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. The prison physician reports heart failure, though she had shown no previous signs of cardiac distress. Among her personal effects was found a detailed journal spanning her final months. The journal entries, which Chalmers had transcribed for our review, revealed the complete psychological unraveling of a woman whose rigid worldview could not accommodate the destruction she had wrought in service of what she believed to be family honor. "I have become everything I sought to protect the family from," her final entry read. "The ghosts of the Meridian have claimed their victory, not through vengeance, but by transforming me into one of them, a restless spirit haunting the ruins of everything I held sacred." "The human capacity for self-deception," Poirot observed, setting the letter aside, "is perhaps the most dangerous force in creation." When Miss Constance's elaborate justifications finally crumbled, when she saw herself clearly for the first time, her heart could not withstand the revelation. Truth, mon ami, has consequences that extend far beyond legal proceedings. Tangible remembrance. The same morning post brought a more hopeful counterpoint, a carefully wrapped parcel from Warsaw, bearing foreign stamps and Viviana Kowalski's familiar handwriting. Within lay 2 items that would provide the emotional closure the case required. The first was a comprehensive report on the Meridian Survivors Trust, documenting how the fund had grown to nearly £100,000 and had successfully located 23 families with direct connections to the disaster. Names and stories that had been mere shadows in our investigation now appeared in careful typescript. Families in Gdansk and Hamburg, widows in New York, children's education funds in Buenos Aires. The second item, wrapped in tissue paper with reverent care, was a small framed photograph showing a family of 4 standing on a quay. A man and woman in modest continental dress rested their hands on the shoulders of a young boy and girl, while behind them, barely in focus, loomed the graceful lines of a passenger ship. "My family, before the Meridian," read the inscription in English beneath the Polish original. "For your keeping, Viviana." Poirot studied the photograph with characteristic intensity before moving to place it among his carefully curated mementos on the mantelpiece. "She sends us more than a photograph, Hastings," he said quietly. "She makes us witnesses, not only to the crimes, but to the efforts made to redress them." The memorial's message. Viviana's accompanying letter provided details of the memorial she had established in Warsaw, a simple granite stone bearing the names of all 127 passengers and crew who perished when the Meridian foundered. The inscription she had chosen was both modest and profound. "Their voices, long silenced, are heard again." "The work continues," she wrote. "But with each family contacted, each story acknowledged, I feel the weight of 20 years' silence lifting. Justice may wear many faces, Monsieur Poirot, but its essence is always the same, the restoration of dignity to those who have been forgotten." Poirot's philosophical summation. As spring deepened and London shed its winter shroud, Poirot began what he termed his philosophical summation of the case. His notes, written in precise handwriting, revealed the depth of his engagement with the moral complexities we had encountered. "The affair at Whitehaven Manor," he wrote, "demonstrates that the past, however carefully buried, will always seek resurrection. Each principal figure pursued what they believed to be justice, yet their interpretations differed profoundly. Jan Kowalski sought retributive justice, punishment for those who wronged his family. Miss Constance perverted protective justice, turning legitimate family loyalty into murderous self-interest. Lord Bartholomew, belatedly, pursued confessional justice, acknowledgement and atonement for past sins. He paused in his writing, considering the photograph now gracing his mantelpiece. But only Lady Vivian understood that true justice requires not vengeance but acknowledgement, not punishment but the restoration of dignity to those who have been wronged. Her transformation from victim to advocate, from a woman seeking personal revenge to one facilitating collective healing, represents the highest form of human growth, the enduring symbol. On a particularly fine afternoon, as we sat by our open windows listening to the sounds of London's renewal, I found myself returning to the image that had started it all, the widow in white at her husband's wake. That dress, I mused aloud. It seems almost prophetic now, doesn't it? Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Indeed, Hastings, in a house built upon secrets, maintained by deception, and ultimately shattered by the weight of unacknowledged wrongs, Lady Vivian alone chose to be unmistakably, defiantly visible. Her white dress was not scandal, but symbol, a beacon, illuminating the scene and allowing the little grey cells to perceive the true colors beneath the camouflage. He adjusted his tie with meticulous precision, that familiar gesture signaling both completion and readiness. The human heart is a complicated mechanism, full of springs and cogs, passions and regrets. But even the most convoluted device can be understood if one applies the proper method and necessary patience. The continuing work. As the anniversary of our first visit to Whitehaven Manor approached, Poirot completed his case notes with characteristic thoroughness. His conclusion looked as much toward the future as the past. "The little grey cells tell us that human nature is both remarkably consistent and endlessly surprising," he wrote. "People will continue to love unwisely, hate destructively, and conceal shamefully. There will always be mysteries to solve, secrets to uncover, and justice to pursue." He looked up from his writing, his green eyes reflecting the spring sunlight. "But this case has taught us something more important than mere detection techniques, Hastings. It has shown us that the greatest mysteries are not about who committed crimes, but about why people choose to live with buried guilt rather than seek redemption through truth." Final reflections. As evening settled over London and the season's first warm breeze stirred our curtains, I reflected on the extraordinary journey we had completed. The widow who wore white to the wake had indeed chosen her costume with wisdom beyond her conscious intention. In a world too often dressed in the black of concealment and deception, she had possessed the courage to appear in the white of truth revealed. The ghosts of the meridian were finally at peace, not through vengeance, but through the restoration of their voices and the acknowledgement of their suffering. Miss Constance's death had provided the final piece of justice's complex puzzle, while Viviana's memorial work ensured that the lessons learned would endure. Poirot closed his case file with a satisfied smile, the photograph of the Kowalski family now permanently part of his collection of meaningful mementos. "The affair at Whitehaven Manor is concluded, mon ami, but its lessons will endure. Truth, like justice, is persistent. It may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever." He rose and moved to the window, where the last light of day painted the London skyline in shades of gold and promise. "And when the next mystery presents itself, for there will always be another. We shall be ready. The little grey cells, they never rest, for as long as there are human hearts, there will always be puzzles for Hercule Poirot to solve. The widow who wore white to the wake had chosen her costume more wisely than anyone could have known. Her courage in choosing truth over concealment, acknowledgement over silence, had ultimately proven more powerful than any weapon or deception. The affair at Whitehaven Manor was truly concluded, but its deeper truths about guilt, redemption, and the persistent nature of justice would continue to guide Hercule Poirot's remarkable mind through all the mysteries yet to come. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not the solving of crimes, but the triumph of truth over the darkness of buried secrets and the restoration of dignity to those whose voices had been too long silenced by the weight of others' shame.